Hello and welcome to the December 2023 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Vicken Cheterian, who teaches history and international relations at the University of Geneva. In the December edition of the paper, he writes about Azerbaijan's recent military offensive to seize control of the disputed enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, in an article entitled Armenia Stands Alone. Before we get to the interview, just a quick reminder that all previous episodes of this podcast are on the website at mondediplo.com, and you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss another episode. Much has clearly changed since the last time Armenia and Azerbaijan came to blows over the fate of the ethnically Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, when Russia intervened, mediated and sent in peacekeepers. Relations between Armenia and Russia have since cooled. Azerbaijan, meanwhile, has managed simultaneously to develop stronger partnerships with Russia, the US and the EU, and it has close ties with Israel. We talk about all this in the interview, but when we spoke in mid-December, I began by asking Vicken to set recent events in their wider context.
So on the 19th of September this year, Azerbaijani military launched a full-fledged military attack against Armenian positions in Nagorno-Karabakh. And in a matter of few days, they managed to take control of the region and to force the population, the entire population, so it's around 100,000 people, to flee their homeland and to seek refuge in neighboring Armenia. This attack comes after 9 months of a blockade that Azerbaijan imposed on the region. So the population was nearing starvation, and it lacked medication, it lacked fuel, it lacked benzene, and so on. And what is particular about this attack is that it came in a period where Azerbaijan was negotiating both with Armenia and with the de facto leadership of Nagorno-Karabakh. So there are negotiations going on, but nevertheless, Azerbaijan decides to use force to take control over the region. The second curious thing is that Russian peacekeepers who were deployed there since 2020 war, they did not interfere. So they let Azerbaijani military realize an attack and total ethnic cleansing. Now, maybe to remind that Nagorno-Karabakh is in fact a Soviet-era phenomenon. The Soviets created this entity, gave it an autonomous status because of its majority Armenian population. But the curiosity is that the Soviets also decided to put this Armenian political entity within Soviet Azerbaijan, instead of placing it within neighboring Soviet Armenia. So there we see that the Soviets were following a very imperial logic of creating entities that arranged the interests of the center and not necessarily local realities. So instead of solving this conflict, they postponed this conflict for a later period. And in fact, in 1988, this arrangement, which was against nature, exploded when the local Armenians asked for self-determination and asked for being detached from being under Soviet Azerbaijan and to be unified with neighboring Armenia. This was in February 1988, and a week later we have pogroms against Armenians inside Azerbaijan proper. So we see that very rapidly a political demand was transformed into inter-ethnic conflict between Armenians and Azerbaijanis throughout the South Caucasus. Later, when the Soviet Union collapsed, this became an international conflict because Armenia and Azerbaijan had emerged to become members of the UN. And at the end of this first war, which lasted from 1991 till 1994, the Armenian side ended up being the winners, although in the war they had huge difficulties, but eventually they took control of Karabakh, but also took control of 7 Azerbaijani provinces around. Between 1994 and 2020, we have long period of negotiations, during which the formula was that Armenians would give back the Azerbaijani provinces, and in return will receive security guarantees and the right to self-determination. But in the last years, tensions were growing, and eventually those tensions led to the 2020 war.
You said there, Vicken, that at the time of the recent war, or the recent fighting, Armenia, Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh were engaged in negotiations. So had those negotiations broken down, or was Azerbaijan not negotiating in good faith, or is it impossible to tell exactly how they went from negotiating to conflict?
No, I mean, there were negotiations, but at the same time, there was no approach from the Azerbaijani side to solve the conflict and to achieve peace. Azerbaijan wanted and wants to dictate its views on the Armenian side, and Azerbaijan simply felt that now is the time to impose its perspective because of its military advantage, but also because Azerbaijan has massive support coming from Turkey and from Israel. And at the same time, Azerbaijan managed to establish very good relations with Russia, the other major military power in the region. So both militarily, but also strategically, Azerbaijan is superior to the Armenian side at the moment, and it wants to take full advantage of this superiority.
And presumably Azerbaijan knew that it would not receive any significant opposition from Russia because, as you say, relations between Azerbaijan and Russia have strengthened even since the 2020 war. So presumably they pressed ahead with a fairly secure knowledge that they wouldn't be impeded.
In fact, yes, even in 2020 war, Russia, which has a military treaty and security treaty with Armenia, instead of supporting Armenia, chose to play the role of the mediator between two sides and eventually intervened after the Armenian side was nearly defeated. And one should also mention that just 2 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, the Azerbaijani leader, Ilham Aliyev, went to Moscow and signed a very long treaty of alliance with Russia. And this shows that Russian-Azerbaijani relationship is very warm, and Azerbaijan provides certain services to Russia, which Russia needs at the moment. And maybe the last point is that Russia militarily today is very much engaged in an exhaustive war in Ukraine and does not have the military leverage to impose its views on Azerbaijan. So it's a question of not willing, but also not having the means. And it's obvious that there was a very clear agreement between Azerbaijan and Russia before the September attack. This is very evident.
And Azerbaijan has a geographical appeal to Putin, if I can put it like that. It's been quite a significant aid in circumventing sanctions, hasn't it, to Russia? So it's got a very, in addition to being an oil state, it's also got geostrategic advantage from where it's located in the world.
That is true. It seems that Azerbaijan is playing a significant role logistically for Russia to reach out and realize trade deals with a number of economic partners in the south. But also it seems that Azerbaijan is recycling Russian oil and gas even to EU markets with the knowledge of the EU, but I think they are simply closing their eyes. And the last point is that Putin and Aliyev, they belong to the same group of people. They are people emerging from the Soviet apparatus. Putin and Ilham Aliyev's father, who was the former leader of Azerbaijan, they are both KGB officers. And Putin and Aliyev have the same language and same values, while the Armenian leader, Nikol Pashinyan, he's a former journalist who came to power through a popular revolution. And both Putin and Aliyev hate this kind of people who challenge their order and their class privileges.
And you mentioned there the EU being willing to close its eyes, and the reason for that is hydrocarbons, isn't it? To put it crudely, Azerbaijan has resources which the EU is interested in, and so the EU hasn't been critical of Azerbaijan's actions in any significant way.
Yes, I hear that argument. I think some EU countries, namely Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, and some others, do import Azerbaijani energy. But one should not overestimate EU dependence on Azerbaijani resources. For example, what concerns natural gas, Azerbaijan supplies only 2% of the total EU needs. On the other hand, Azerbaijani dependence on EU markets is much more important. Azerbaijan has only one thing to export, which is hydrocarbons. Over 92% of Azerbaijani exports in 2022 were oil and gas. So Azerbaijan is also very dependent, and the EU has leverages on Azerbaijan. But EU lacked political will. I think EU thought that EU leaders, some of them who are in charge of EU diplomacy, thought that by satisfying Ilham Aliyev, they might bring some stability to the South Caucasus. But the contrary was achieved as a result of EU policies, in fact.
So when President Aliyev said, "We have achieved what we wanted," what exactly is the bigger sort of strategic picture? What was he actually seeking to achieve? Because presumably it has ramifications which go further than this piece of territory. It's presumably got internal and external political implications. So can you say a little bit about the bigger picture for what this action means to Azerbaijan?
Yes, in fact, Ilham Aliyev achieved three things in this series of wars that he started in 2020 and he concluded in September 2023. The first is to take over the territories that Azerbaijan lost in the wars in the 1990s, but also to take total control of the autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabakh. So the first achievement is total territorial control. The second achievement from his perspective is ethnic cleansing. And this shows that the Azerbaijani discourse about international law, about territorial integrity, that they are on the side of international law, is total absurdity. And Azerbaijan is ready to violate series of other laws which international law imposes on state leaders. And even the logic of territorial integrity is that international law wants stability. And this argument was used by Ilham Aliyev to introduce instability and to use it as if it's a weapon of war. So the second point is ethnic cleansing. And this shows that from the beginning, Azerbaijan considered the Karabakh conflict not as an issue of political status, but as a conflict between two communities, as a primordial existential struggle between Azerbaijanis and Armenians. And the third point, which we see it very clearly now, is that this victory gave Ilham Aliyev a kind of legitimacy he never had before. And as a result, his autocratic rule, his dictatorial rule, has been strengthened over the people of Azerbaijan. And since September, we see that Azerbaijani authorities are arresting all kinds of dissident thinkers, journalists, university professors, and the degree of tolerance of dissidents is completely disappearing in Azerbaijan. So in Azerbaijan now we have a population which has only one choice, to follow discourse imposed by the autocratic ruler, or to leave the country, or to end up in prison, basically.
Azerbaijan is very low on the table of journalistic freedoms, isn't it? It seems to have been cracking down recently even further on freedom of expression in recent months.
Absolutely, and this is extremely dangerous because the last autonomous institutions in Azerbaijan, the few little media institutions online, the few thinkers who can think differently and say something interesting about the state of Azerbaijani economy, about social developments, All these people are being silenced today. And when Azerbaijan will face its next crisis, and when the dictatorial model of Ilham Aliyev based on oil and gas revenues, this model stops functioning, then the whole society will be completely disarmed instead of the crisis. So this is very worrying for the future of Azerbaijan and its population.
I saw that the next COP meeting on the climate is taking place next year in Azerbaijan, and I thought that's an interesting choice. The choices are becoming more and more surprising, I think, for where the COP climate negotiations are being held.
It is more than surprising. It is completely disappointing, because going to Azerbaijan to talk about the climate in a country which has zero interest in tackling the climate crisis, where we don't have any experts on climate issues, on the environment, all independent environmental activists end up either in exile or repressed, but also a country which has no traditions of mediation, of diplomacy. The only logic that we have in Azerbaijan is, I have force, I impose it on you. And what we need with the COP29 is the ability to negotiate, ability to find creative answers to the very deep climate crisis we are in. And I mean, in spite of all the nice declarations that we have, let's not forget that the energy consumption is increasing by 2% per year. So and going to Baku will not be very helpful. Symbolically, it is such a bad choice, but here we are.
It does look as though there's a gradual capture taking place of COP and all the associated activities, that the fossil fuel industry is finding more and more ways to infiltrate and sort of exert a stranglehold on negotiations. But I guess that's another subject that we'll perhaps talk about another time. But I wanted to ask you about Israel and its relationship with Azerbaijan, because it seems that it's an intimate relationship, and it's heavily involved in the military sphere with Azerbaijan. Could you say a little bit about that? Because people may not know very much about that.
Yes, indeed. In fact, it's more than in the military sphere. Since the early 1990s, Israel and Azerbaijan entered into a very close collaboration. Israel provides very sophisticated arms to Azerbaijan. It seems, a big percentage of Azerbaijani weapon imports in the last 10 years came from Israel. But also Israel provides lobbying, pro-Azerbaijani lobbying in different circles, and especially in Washington, D.C. So this is also very important. Sometimes people forget about this. It's more than just economic and military interest. In return, Israel receives from Azerbaijan oil. Azerbaijan is the major source of oil for Israel. But also, we know that since around 2012, there's military presence, Israeli military presence in a number of airfields in southern Azerbaijan. And the logic there is that Israel uses Azerbaijan as a logistic platform for its military operations deep inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. So this alliance is much deeper than simply arms exports, and it's of strategic nature.
So Armenia finds itself without any real strong strategic allies in the wider world. Azerbaijan has effectively ethnically cleansed Nagorno-Karabakh of its Armenian population. I read in the New York Times a report that said one of the world's most intractable conflicts ended suddenly when Azerbaijan seized the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. And I thought, has this ended it? Is this effectively the end, if the Armenian population has been cleansed from the territory and Armenia finds itself friendless? Or do you think, what happens from here? Does this really sort of cement the new reality that Azerbaijan has managed to impose? Or do you think there will, in some form, at some point, be a response from Armenia? Or is Armenia now too weak to really mount any kind of response, either significant military or significant diplomatic?
I don't think the conflict ended. And I don't think the source of instability, at least in the short and medium term, will come from Armenia. In fact, in spite of Ilham Aliyev's victories, his appetite for more aggression did not end. And this has structural and ideological preconditions. It seems that Ilham Aliyev built an image of Azerbaijani national identity, which is based on this antagonism with the hated, bad, nasty, violent Armenians. And basically, the Azerbaijani self is based on the negative image of the other, the Armenian. So from that perspective, and this has become so deep and so much imposed on Azerbaijani new generation through education, through schooling, through propaganda in the media, and in a country where you don't have any media freedom. So what Ilham Aliyev says is not challenged by anyone else, whether this anyone else is opposition parties, parliamentarians, or independent experts saying that his version of history is not historical, is ideological. So there's that, but also we see that Azerbaijan has territorial demands on Armenia. Azerbaijan wants to have territorial access to Nakhichevan, and Azerbaijan in the last wars occupied strategic heights deep inside Armenia. So how things will develop, I don't know, but it is evident that Armenia today doesn't have the military means to counter Azerbaijan. But down the road, when this balance of forces changes, and if this logic of confrontation and ethnic hatred does not change in one way or another, then I don't see that this conflict ends here. All the preconditions are there for the conflict to continue, unfortunately.
I was speaking to Vicken Cheterian, whose article in this month's paper is entitled Armenia Stands Alone. You can read Vicken's article at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back over 25 years and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one, including the full archive of this podcast. You'll find all previous episodes on Le Monde Diplomatic's website, and you can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I'll be back again in the new year with another interview with one of our contributors. So until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.